Hi, everybody. This is Adam Ellenboss from Nightlight Astrology. It is June 3rd today, and we have a new moon in the sign of Gemini. So I'm going to take a little bit to talk about this new moon and give you some things to think about. All right. So I'll highlight this new moon on the chart so that you can see it. First of all, got this right here. When the moon and sun get together at the same degree of the zodiac, that's a new moon. New moons are a part of every month. Every month starts with a new moon. And the general meaning of a new moon is related to the start of a new cycle. So you'll see all astrologers everywhere talking about new beginnings. Now, one of the things to remember in general is that the moon represents the ebb and flow of events happening in the material world. And the events that happen in the material world in general follow predictable cycles, whether we're talking about the weather, the seasons, the cycling of the elements, the cycling of the planets. There is a sense of order and pattern that's built into the universe. And it's also, ancient astrologers considered it all cyclical, understandably, since the invention of time, really, the way that we keep time in society was rooted in astronomical cycles. So time was considered circular or cyclical on some level. So whenever we have a new moon, what you're really talking about is the start of a new theme, a new season, a new period of time. And there are 12, sometimes going on 13 cycles, lunation cycles in a solar year. So there's a synchronization between those 12 lunar cycles that also constitute or comprise the 12 signs or portions of the zodiacal circle, which represents the solar year. So as the cycle unfolds, we have a natural it's a calendrical circular movement, and it's a cycle that is unfolding in the material sense in relation to our karma. So what is our karma? Well, ancient astrologers, East and West, basically believed that there is we each have a soul, and that this soul is eternal, that it's not ultimately bound or defined by time or by the different bodies that it takes on. And so as the soul comes into a body, it enters that body after having been in previous bodies over a very long period of time. And the current body that we take and the current life circumstances that unfold around us and within us are the results of free choices that have been made in the past that land us in this body in these circumstances based on our nature of our soul, the previous choices we've made, the continued consequences of those choices flowing into this new body and this new lifetime, and the intelligence of the soul. So birth charts are always reflecting something of the field of karma that we're born into, that represents the continued flow of our soul embodying in these cycles of material nature. So at the same time, we have free will. We have some way, you've ever been floating down a river on an inner tube, for example, you know that if you, depending on where you put your foot in the water or where you put your hands in the water, you can guide to a certain extent within the current and flow of the river, within the parameters of the banks on either side. You can sort of direct your course. There are obstacles that come. There are things that are more difficult to navigate than others. But there is some sense of us also navigating the field into which we are born, and the destiny or the destined events that are coming are partially, necessary, undeniable, things that we cannot change. And then there are also things that we can. And really, truly, most astrologers do not and cannot know the difference. And so we always look at charts with a predictive eye, trying to understand what kinds of things are going to unfold in a fated kind of way, in which way is the current of the river flowing, and is in which way are there certain destined events or activities that are going to happen that are sort of a guarantee. We keep an eye on that. We try to get a sense of what that might be. But we also can say something about the nature of the events, the nature of the river, the nature of the contours of the river. And we say that in a way that also gives people some room to hopefully navigate, because we are also free agents that are continually creating new karma, new consequences for the future, as well as responding to the current position that we're in and to the fated events that are coming. So you might bump into a log as you're floating down the river, but you still have to manage how you're going to respond to having bumped into that log. So this is a very ancient astrology is very, very dynamic in this regard. It's always giving us a picture of the sky is always a picture of what is happening, where the karmic trajectory is flowing, and what is likely to happen as a result of previous choices, as well as the nature of where everything is flowing. So it's very dynamic to understand all of that. Every moon cycle at the beginning, year round, is telling us, and now we're hitting over again. And now we're starting over again. And return again and start new. Now, sometimes when we start new, we're repeating the same thing. For example, I was a competitive swimmer growing up. You have 3-4 strokes, and then you take a breath. 3-4 strokes, and then you take a breath. Okay, so if you imagine that and in rhythm too, in music, you're playing a certain beat, and then you return again to the first beat in the measure. You play a certain beat on a drum or something, you come back to the same thing that you started with. So this is a rhythm, and it's a refrain, and it's also a starting point. Sometimes the use of the word starting point gets overdone because we're thinking about, well, now I have to, start doing something. We mostly think about like you'll hear people all over being like, it's new moon, set an intention, right? And of course, there's nothing wrong with this, but we have to understand that a new moon is not just about setting an intention. A new moon is in a sense the refrain of a rhythm, and just getting to know and feel that rhythm, we become more intelligent. We start to recognize the mood of the world around us and how it's flowing, and then we become more intelligent navigators. Or we understand the way in which the river's flowing, so we anticipate, yeah, there's some things coming. I feel it, I know it, like that. So new moons are in some ways a time to reset your biorhythm, your karma rhythm, your cosmo rhythm. It's a time to come back to something that and like kind of get fresh and start over, however you do that. It's also a tempting time to try to return to bad habits, to say, oh, okay, fresh start. Let me now, like for example, when I was younger and I had in my early 20s, and I wrote a book about this, I had trouble with opiate addiction. And I remember, as someone who was addicted for a few years to opiates, that, as soon as the day was fresh and I was sober, it was like, ah. And then pretty soon it was like, now when is, now it's pretty soon it'll be time for my fix. You know what I mean? And I wasn't doing heroin or anything, but I was doing other opiates. And I think Oxycontin must be a staple of the restaurant industry, honestly, because I worked in restaurants while I was in school, and that was how it flowed into my life for the most part. I actually started with an injury. I got hooked on them because I had an injury, and I was taking, I don't remember what it was, Vicodin, I think it was. And then I had encountered more of this harder stuff like Oxycontin when I was working in restaurants. Anyway, I wrote a book about all of that, and ended up using ayahuasca over the course of 10 years and really got sober. It's a great purgative from the Amazon. So at any rate, a new moon can also be the kind of moment where you're like, I feel fresh. So now let me just dive back into my bad habits. We can miss the opportunity of a new moon sometimes, which is to really, truly think of something new to intend in our lives. Like a lot of the times when people say set a new intention, but they're saying it every single month, what is that doing? Sometimes it's doing nothing more than telling us to get back to trying to do the same old things or get the same old results or struggle with the same desires, attachments, or fears. So a new moon is an important time. I like to think of it more as a time where it's a time to reset and be empty and to receive. A lot of the times the setting intention is really in some ways very contrary to the nature of a new moon, which is very receptive. It's a totally dark moon. You can't see it at all. And it's behind the light of the sun. One thing that's very hard to imagine for us is that being a servant is a happier and more fulfilled place to be than being a master. The main reason for this is that our world is built on the idea that it is good to be a master and it is bad to be a slave of a master. And that is, there's a lot of history around that in the world. People who have a lot exploiting those who have little, or taking people and using them in order to maintain their own elite status. This has happened in every corner of the world. So, but we often think that the way out of this, right, the way out of this vicious cycle is to try to free, like in the, just common workaday world, is to try to free ourselves of whatever oppresses us. Good. I want to be free of what oppresses me, and I can understand why everyone would want to. But then we think, well, in order to do that, I have to get more power, right? And the power could be relative. Like, well, I don't want that much. I just want like a better paying job. I'd like a better relationship life, I'd like a better sex life, I'd like a better body. I'd like I'm not asking for much here, right? So it's understandable. I just want to get out from under some of these more oppressive conditions. And of course, the whole advertising world is meant to feed that sense that, like, yeah, you just deserve a little bit more. I deserve a little bit more. You deserve a little bit more. Let's just get a little bit more, just get ahead a little bit more, or create a little bit brighter future or whatever. And there's everyone's pining for getting more and getting ahead and lifting out of some inferior condition. But so long as we stay locked in identifying within that cycle and that circle of power or lack of power or comparative power, right? As long as we stay really locked into that cycle, it will be a survival of the fittest paradigm that will continue to dominate us on every level. So how do we check out of that paradigm, right? And that's really, really difficult to do. I'm not claiming that I've done it or anything, but and what does astrology have to say about that? Well, one thing that I want to talk about today was there's this way in which that paradigm of growth and power and success and it's kind of upward momentum and get a little bit more, personally empowered, liberate yourself. This has a way of sneaking into astrology as well. And I think it sneaks in specifically around the way that we talk about new moons or the moon cycle in general. Now it's new moon. It's time to manifest something. It's time to get something. It's time to do something. It's time to intend for something. And we have a very hard time imagining that being a servant of this divine energy that's flowing through us and everything that is everything is comprised of. We have a really hard time imagining that we could be happiest looking and seeking to be a servant of the creative force, the creative source that we're all a part of. It's just fundamentally to us, we just feel like, well, why would we immediately think of things that may have been impressed upon us in, religiously difficult environments, like, oh, well, you should be a servant of God. Someone says that, and it's like, well, I don't want to be the servant of some tyrant king who just wants everyone to be his servant. It sounds really sort of patriarchal and oppressive. But I don't think that's the paradigm of service to divinity. I don't think that that's the kind of service that our great saints of all different traditions, men and women, have taught us. Instead, I think what they've taught us, whether you're talking about Mother Teresa, Teresa of Avila, St. Francis in the Christian tradition, or the Bodhisattvas, the Buddha, the great Hindu saints and sages, Jesus, all these different traditions, even great, I'm thinking Black Elk in the Native American tradition. The message has been that rather than thinking about exerting our will and exerting our force because of something that we want or we need or we are or we, whatever, And it's so pervasive, that move, that like, let me do something for me. It's all the time, always. It's like it's a constant. That impulse is destructive ultimately, and domineering and violent. And so when we say being a servant, what we really mean is, how can I align myself with something that I'm a part of, but that's also bigger than me? It's bigger than just my will. So when you're floating down the river, you're thinking, how can I, move with the river, right? How can I intelligently move with the currents? And doing that means that the number one thing that we start to do rather than exert is to listen. And listening isn't just something we do with our ears. It's something we do with our being. To really listen, you have to be in touch with your whole being, because your whole being is fundamentally receptive. In fact, in most mystical traditions, including ancient astrology, the real meaning of the feminine is all of created all created reality. Everything that emanates from source is feminine. One of the reasons I think that it would be really nice to have more feminine leadership in the world is because I believe the world and the entire universe is essentially feminine. That's the metaphysics that I personally believe in. And so the real happiness of the feminine in relation to creative source, at least as I understand it in the context of the bhakti teachings that are at the core of my own spiritual life, is to figure out how to be in union with, but also in service to that source. And service doesn't mean subservience. We have to take the idea of service out of this kind of master-slave, capitalist, materialist, ego-centered paradigm. To really understand devotion or service, we have to think of ourselves as our very being as receptive. So when we open ourselves up and we're really receptive, then the yang impulse, the source impulse, the creative impulse, it flows through us and it directs us. It's like the Force in Star Wars, right? The difference between a dark manipulator of the Force who wants an empire, right? And the Jedis basically is that the Jedis allow the Force to flow through them and guide their actions. The dark side of the Force is all about trying to dominate and use the Force and for power. So similarly, in the true sense, our souls are, and they're described all over in ancient Greek as well, as feminine in relation to the quote unquote masculine source. But masculine and feminine should, the words masculine and feminine are also so charged for us nowadays because they participate in the power structures of the world and the master-slave mentality and the cycle of consumption and fear and domination and what have you. So the words are triggering for a lot of people in ancient astrology, but we, of course, we're missing the deeper esoteric meaning, which is to some extent that all manifest reality and all emanated souls from the source are, in a sense, receptive. They're the negative charge in relation to the positive. So if we want to have a relationship with source, with God, whatever word you prefer, that relationship requires us to become receptive. Now, I'm saying all of this today, but you're thinking, why about a full moon or new moon, in Gemini? Is Adam talking all about new moons and all of this philosophy? Well, because we're in the sign of the twins. And Mercury is a planet that is the mythical ruler of astrology. The legendary founder of astrology is Hermes Trismegistus. And in both, there's two signs, a masculine, quote unquote, and a feminine, quote unquote, sign that Hermes resides in. And the masculine sign of Gemini is a sign that along with the feminine sign, express a peculiar duality for Hermes in particular. Both signs are what we call double-bodied signs, which means that they both feature this kind of inherent duality for a planet that was also considered very dual in the sense that it was neither masculine nor feminine. It could change sect status depending on its position relative to the sun and the day or night. It could change sect status based on its sign position or its evening or morning star appearances. And it was also the planet that took its joy in the first place, which is the place most fundamentally associated with the soul of the native first house. And so both signs, but we'll talk about Gemini today, feature this kind of inherent duality that's a secret union in duality, and also a simultaneous participation in both the yin and the yang that both brings them together but also separates and divides them. And Hermes participates in this more than any other planet, and is the patron of astrology itself, and is the significator in some ways of the soul, being in its joy in the first place, which is the place of the soul, the house of the soul. So the sun in Gemini, a new moon in Gemini, on some very basic level, invites us to reenact or what do I want to say? Reactivate our awareness of ourselves as people who are, we are built of source energy, and yet we are distinct, separate from, and apart from that source energy, just like sparks are to a fire, or just like you could say, just like the sunbeams are from the sun. Like there's light streaming in from my window right now. That's sun, non-different from the sun. And yet it is different from the sun. Non-different, same, but also distinct and different. So the soul is like that as well. And it's only when we really come to live our lives trying to work into the mystery of what that means, and how the realized knowledge of that duality might start to fill us and guide and shape our path, that that it's only when we really spend time with that that we start to understand what real happiness is. Because real happiness for the ancient mystics, and I would dare to say for Hermes, if you read the Hermetica is littered with this evidence. Real happiness is found in understanding that we are little sparks of the whole, and that our true happiness in being autonomous agents with free will is to figure out how to use our free will, how to remain receptive, so that the free will we do have can be used to help shape, move, and direct the course of divine Leela, divine play, divine bliss, divine consciousness, divine knowledge, divine relationships, divine world. A lot of people don't think of Gemini that way. We say, oh, Gemini is two-faced, or we say Gemini is tricky, or Gemini is inconsistent, or Gemini likes to change their mind a lot. But these are just scratching the surface. These are psychological character descriptions, mostly within the rat race world, within the world of comparisons and power struggles and so forth. When we talk about any sign, what to speak of, the esoteric meaning of a sign or a new moon in a sign, we always should try to pare down to the deepest, most esoteric symbolism of the sign, because that's what the spiritual teaching is all about. So, for example, a new moon in Cancer, what are the teachings of the moon? A new moon in Leo, what are the teachings of the sun? What are the teachings of Hermes? What are the teachings of Mercury? Now, practically speaking, how do we translate this into our practical lives? Because as we're flowing down the river, it's not just some pure energy ride, where the river appears in 3D. There are people, there are events, there are family members, there are our personal karma. It's a fantastic matrix, and it is very real to us, right? And so How do we take the teachings of Hermes and apply them? Well, right now, we're at a cusp. We're reaching the very top of the solar year, and we're about to turn and start moving down. Cancer, the next sign that's coming, eclipse is coming in Cancer next month, very beginning of July. So we're at this point where we have to ask the question. We're standing on the threshold of a distinct turning point. That's what all the cardinal signs represents, the solstice and equinox points. The summer solstice, we're going to start heading down towards the winter solstice. We're reaching our peak right now. And as we reach that peak, we get a survey of the year behind us and the year ahead of us. And we can make some very deep and meaningful distinctions between where we've been and where we're going. We can also gain a double-bodied or dual awareness of the big picture, as well as, the forest and the trees. And we can see both at once. Another thing that can happen right now, it's a very good time to carefully reflect upon those currents that have us. Because Gemini can very easily separate and see itself as distinct from the larger force, the larger current, opposite sign Jupiter, Sagittarius, right? You can sort of see yourself apart from that larger force. And maybe there's some healthy disentangling that we need to do. Critical awareness and reflectiveness and getting some distance. On the other hand, you can also see yourself as an individual, as something sort of discrete or, sort of separate. And you can say, which larger forces do I need to join myself with, align myself with, and flow with? So the beauty of this moment is by being able to be critical, we can separate ourselves from forces that have us flowing along, maybe in an unconscious way. But we can also look and say, like my ego has been going along on a separate mission of some kind, and there is a larger force that I'm serving, and we can become receptive and say, how do I serve? So Mercury's role as the psychopomp, the guide of souls. It's a good time to call on your guides. It's a good time to, intend, if you want to intend something, intend to receive a message. Because Mercury, as the planet of messengers and as the planet that governs over the hermeneutic experience, which is the experience of interpreting and receiving messages and making sense of them and then doing something about them, that's really strong right now. And it's going to get a little bit trickier to do that pretty soon, because not long after the new moon, Mercury is going to go into Cancer, the sign of the moon. Right as it does that, the rest of the cycle will really be dictated in large part by the constant fluctuations of the moon. And Mercury is also going to get into some really hard oppositions with Mars and Saturn and Pluto. So I'm seeing this new moon. My basic message for everyone today is to be thoughtful, to be reflective, to be receptive, and let that receptivity deliver a message, and let that message guide us. So that's what I have for today. I hope I didn't leave anything out or forget anything. This was for me, I had some things I wanted to talk about, but true to Mercurial Gemini form, I was like, well, I've got some basic ideas. We'll see how it flows. I'll leave myself open and see how it goes. So please share with me your experiences. Remember, this new moon is also in square with Neptune, in opposition with Jupiter. So it's a powerful moment to do this kind of reflecting that I'm talking about. Remember, try to repeat this mantra to yourself throughout the month. My deepest happiness is found in becoming a receptive agent of the divine or of the source. How can my first impulse not be about me and my will and my ego and my way, but how can my first impulse become, how can I serve? What could I do? What would make you happy? If you've ever been in a relationship and you know how amazing it is to find something that really, really makes the person that you love happy, and you discover that, and then you get really excited to do that for them, that's just the ultimate pleasure. As a parent, I see that too with my kids. What is the deepest thing I could do that I know is really going to make my daughter happy right now, or my wife happy, or my friends happy? And as I grow, and the more I study bhakti in particular, which is part of my spiritual path, the more I realize that this is really our deepest treasure. So what to speak of trying to figure out what makes our source happy, right? But imagine if that becomes the number one thing that we're actually interested in. How does that change our heart? How does that change so that our whole being becomes a better listener? In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, just love me, surrender to me, and I'll give you the intelligence that you need. So, dare we say that the greatest freedom, the greatest happiness is actually found in becoming a receptive agent of our source, a receptive agent of the divine. Okay, so everybody take care, have a great moon cycle, and we'll see you again soon. Take care. Bye.